11 minutes. Not a war, not an invasion, not a missile strike. 11 minutes. The length of a short commute, the time it takes to brew coffee and scan the morning headlines. In 11 minutes, the most expensive phone call in modern diplomatic history ended with a sound that has now been heard around the world. A dial tone. The President of the United States hung up on the Prime Minister of Canada while he was still speaking. Mid-sentence, mid-compromise, mid-offer. And in doing so, he destroyed a deal worth over $100 billion, triggered the most comprehensive retaliatory package ever deployed between allied democracies, and handed his opponent 9 words that silenced a parliament and reached every camera on Earth. This is the Global Report. Tonight, we take you inside the call that ended everything. Before we continue, we want to hear from you. If the leader of your closest ally hung up on your head of state mid-sentence, destroying a compromise worth over $100 billion, what would your country's first move be? Would you call for restraint, or would you retaliate before the hour was out? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Tell us where you are writing from. We read every response. The call had been agreed upon by both governments as the final opportunity for direct resolution before the next round of retaliation was scheduled to begin. It was set for 45 minutes. Both sides knew what was at stake. The Canadian government had spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive compromise framework specifically designed to give the American side everything it had publicly demanded while allowing both leaders to claim progress. The call began, 11 minutes passed, and then the line went dead. Not a technical failure, not a dropped connection. The President of the United States terminated the call while the leader of a G7 ally, a NATO partner, and a Five Eyes intelligence partner was presenting the third provision of that framework. The line did not reconnect, because it was never meant to. For 6 hours and 14 minutes after that call ended, Ottawa said nothing. No statement, no press conference, no leaked fury, no emergency media availability. In Washington, that silence was interpreted exactly the way the White House had hoped. Senior advisors reportedly described it as the most primal display of dominance in the diplomatic playbook. One advisor told colleagues that Carney had gotten the message, that sometimes you have to show them who is in charge. That was the assessment. That was the celebration. And that was the miscalculation. Because the silence from Ottawa was not shock. It was not submission. It was the sound of a government preparing the most devastating single-day retaliatory package in the history of relations between allied democracies. Within 24 hours, Canada announced 5 simultaneous measures. First, immediate tariffs on American exports across 7 politically sensitive sectors: agricultural products, manufactured goods, technology hardware, pharmaceutical ingredients, financial services, entertainment media, and construction materials. These tariffs were not calibrated by economists alone. They were calibrated by political strategists. They were concentrated in swing states the president could not afford to lose. The estimated first-year cost to American exporters from this single measure alone was $4.7 billion. Second, energy export restrictions affecting 12 American states. Canada reduced natural gas and electricity exports by 18%. Not enough to trigger a full energy crisis. Precisely enough to spike heating costs and make headlines in every affected state. The message from Ottawa was unmistakable. We could have cut 100%. We chose 18. Notice the restraint. Third, the recall of the Canadian ambassador to the United States. The first such recall in the 158-year history of the bilateral relationship. All bilateral meetings, working groups, joint committees, and cooperative frameworks were suspended indefinitely. The suspension was conditioned not on a policy change, on what Ottawa formally called a demonstration of diplomatic conduct consistent with the norms governing relations between sovereign democracies, a behavioral change. Fourth, the suspension of defense cooperation frameworks, including elements of NORAD joint operations and certain intelligence sharing protocols under the Five Eyes Alliance. This measure was designed to send a signal to the one constituency in Washington the White House could not afford to alienate: the Pentagon. By disrupting the defense relationship, Canada guaranteed that military leadership would apply internal pressure for resolution with an urgency that economic damage alone could not generate. Fifth, the measure nobody in Washington had anticipated: a complete regulatory freeze on American financial institutions operating in Canadian markets. Banks, investment firms, insurance companies, and fintech operations with Canadian licenses were frozen. Unable to open new accounts, launch new products, execute new transactions, or expand existing operations. For the 5 largest American banks, each with significant Canadian holdings, this represented immediate revenue disruption and permanent strategic loss. As one Wall Street analyst wrote afterward, market share loss during a regulatory freeze does not come back. This is permanent damage disguised as a temporary measure. Every single one of these measures was linked in the official Canadian government statement not to trade policy, not to tariffs, not to any economic grievance. but to what Ottawa formally described as the conduct of the President of the United States during bilateral diplomatic communications. Which means that if the President had simply stayed on the line for 45 minutes, none of this would be happening tonight. Then came the moment that turned an 11-minute phone call into a permanent mark on diplomatic history. Standing in the House of Commons with every member present and the diplomatic gallery filled with ambassadors from 30 countries, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke without notes. He addressed the call directly. He said, "Yesterday afternoon, I called the President of the United States. The call was scheduled for 45 minutes. It was agreed upon by both governments as the final opportunity for direct resolution of this crisis. My government spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive compromise framework, a framework that addressed American economic concerns, offered American consumers real savings, secured American supply chains, and was deliberately structured to allow both sides to claim progress." He paused. Then he continued, "The call lasted 11 minutes. The President terminated it while I was speaking. The last sound I heard from the leader of our closest ally was a dial tone." Another pause. Then this. "There are many things a sovereign nation can absorb during a difficult negotiation. Economic pressure, harsh rhetoric, unreasonable demands. Those are the instruments of hard bargaining. And Canada has demonstrated for 2 years that it can withstand every one of them without compromising its sovereignty or its composure. But there is one thing no nation can absorb and maintain its self-respect: contempt. The President of the United States did not reject our proposal. He did not counter it. He did not engage with it. He hung up, and hanging up is not a negotiating position. It is a statement that the other party does not deserve to be heard." Then came 9 words that silenced the chamber and reached every camera on Earth. Carney looked directly into the lens and said, "You hung up. We showed up." Notice the difference. The chamber erupted. The ovation lasted over a minute. Within an hour, that quote was trending in 14 countries. Within 24 hours, notice the difference had become the phrase that captured the entire 2-year arc of the confrontation. Second question of the evening. Do you think those 9 words were the right response? Or should Carney have kept the tone strictly diplomatic? Tell us in the comments. Specify whether you come from a political, business, or general viewer background. We are already seeing responses come in, and the split is striking. Here is the detail that transforms the hang-up from an insult into a catastrophe. The compromise framework that Carney was presenting when the line went dead was, by every objective analysis, the best deal the United States had been offered at any point in the 2-year confrontation. The energy provision alone, the one interrupted mid-sentence, would have secured Canadian natural gas and electricity exports at preferential rates for 15 years, saving American consumers an estimated $47 billion over the life of the agreement. The critical mineral provisions would have guaranteed American defense contractors priority access to Canadian nickel, cobalt, and lithium, materials the Pentagon has identified as strategically essential. The trade provisions would have reopened Canadian markets to American agricultural and manufactured exports worth an estimated $12 billion annually. Total economic value of the framework to the United States, calculated by 3 independent analyses, ranged from $89 to $114 billion over a 10-year horizon. And then Carney made clear that none of it was coming back. He said, "The offer that was on the table yesterday is no longer on the table. It will not be resubmitted. It will not be renegotiated." A nation does not spend 3 weeks building a compromise for a partner who will not spend 45 minutes listening to it. The fallout was immediate. Natural gas prices in the 12 affected states rose between 14 and 22% within the first week. The governor of Michigan held a press conference and said, "My constituents are going to pay more to heat their homes this winter because the President of the United States could not be bothered to stay on a phone call for 45 minutes. That is where we are." The governor of Minnesota said, "I need someone in Washington to explain to the families in my state why their heating bills are going up because the president hung up on a man who was offering us cheaper energy." 3 Republican senators from energy-affected states issued a joint statement demanding immediate diplomatic engagement. Language everyone in Washington understood as a demand that someone apologize without using the word. The financial freeze produced panic in a sector that had assumed itself immune to bilateral trade actions. Bank stocks dropped between 3 and 6% on the first trading day. One analyst wrote, "This is a slow-acting poison. Every week it continues, Canadian market share flows to competitors who will not return it. This is not a tariff that can be reversed. This is a structural competitive loss that compounds over time." Inside the American delegation, the anger was not directed at Canada. Officials from the American side, including the trade representative and the national security advisor, were reportedly furious with the president. One told colleagues, "We had a deal. We were listening to a deal that gave us everything we have been asking for, and he hung up because he did not want to listen to the details." This is not tough negotiation. This is self-sabotage. The international reaction crystallized around one question every allied leader was now asking privately, and several were beginning to ask publicly. If the American president will hang up on Canada, a G7 ally, a NATO partner, a Five Eyes member, the nation that shares the longest peaceful border in human history, will he hang up on me? France's foreign minister said publicly that diplomatic courtesy is not a luxury. It is the infrastructure of international cooperation. One European diplomat told our correspondent, every leader who has a phone call scheduled with the American president is now calculating whether to proceed. Not because they fear the policy disagreement, because they fear the humiliation. And a superpower that its allies fear being humiliated by is a superpower that is losing its allies. So here is where this stands tonight. The President of the United States hung up on the Prime Minister of Canada mid-sentence, mid-compromise, mid-offer. For 6 hours, Ottawa prepared in silence while Washington celebrated. Then, Canada announced 5 simultaneous retaliatory measures targeting $4.7 billion in exports, 12 states' energy supply, 158 years of unbroken diplomatic relations, defense cooperation, and the ability of American banks to grow in Canadian markets. A compromise framework worth up to $114 billion was permanently withdrawn, and Mark Carney stood in the House of Commons and delivered 9 words that have now been translated into more than 24 languages. You hung up. We showed up. Notice the difference. The deal is dead, the retaliation is live, and the world is watching to see who blinks first. But one thing is already clear tonight. The hang-up was meant to show dominance. Instead, it showed contempt. And contempt has a price that dominance can never pay, because the most expensive sound in modern diplomacy is not a threat. It is not a tariff. It is not even a walkout. It is a dial tone when the other side was still talking. If this kind of analysis is what you have been looking for, subscribe to the Global Report right now and hit the bell icon. We publish twice a week. We go further than the headlines every single time. You will not want to miss what comes next. This is the Global Report, the story behind the story. Every time.